Hello, this is Tom Harris. I'm the director of the University Center for Economic Development at the University of Nevada, Reno. And we're picking up a webinar that we've done many times on ag prices, the current ag prices and trends are going on, especially with this COVID-19 pandemic. Mike Helmar and Malieka Bordigioni, I'm from Texas. But anyway, they've been doing some ag prices and forecasts for FAPRI. Let Mike talk about that in detail. But we're picking it back up, and things are, what changes have happened, and it's also to keep people in the ag sector and the economic sectors of Nevada appraised of what's going on in the agricultural market and what things are happening there maybe because of the COVID-19 pandemic. So Mike, go right ahead. Malieka, let me introduce you so you can say your name correctly.
Hi, I'm Malieka Bordigioni, and I'm with the University Center for Economic Development, and I work on the FAPRI project with Mike Helmar.
Mike, you go right ahead.
Okay. Well, as Tom said, I'm Mike Helmar. I work with the University Center for Economic Development as well. And with my colleague, Malieka Bordigioni, I work on the FAPRI project with the part of the Ag Experiment Station as well. Well, today we want to kind of catch up a little bit from what you did several months ago into the beginning of the summer, and just talking about where we're going with the current ag situation in Nevada, particularly with COVID and some of the impacts on that, and where the different important sectors for Nevada. Let me back up. All the ag sectors in Nevada are important, but the major ones, the largest ones in Nevada, what are the developments that are going on with them? And right now we're going to deal with the cow-calf, dairy, some sheep and wool, and then the hay sectors. We're going to talk about those a little bit. And it's going to be relatively brief, but it should give you a flavor for what's going on. So I'm going to share my screen here so that we can, kind of see some of the graphics we're talking about. It's been several months since we've done this. And this is kind of where we're at with both the national and the Nevada ag sectors at this current time, or up close to this current time. Okay, I want to start off with kind of a global overview of what's going on with the global and the U.S. economies. And we're just gonna kind of look at real gross domestic product for both of them to see what's happened. The vertical line that you see there is this year, it's 2020. And these are estimates for this year, since the year isn't over with, that we get from a vendor, an economic consulting firm and forecasting firm, IHS Markit. We get those from them, and they update their forecasts and their estimates every month. So I just want to talk about, this is going to kind of set the stage for us of where we looked at in January. The solid lines are what we expect, or what we expected in January, and the dashed lines are what we expected in August, which is when we did our last update of the Nevada ag sector. The blue line is the world, and the red lines are the U.S. And as you can see that in 2020, the economies of both the world and the U.S. crashed from COVID. This is completely the impact of COVID on the economies, on economic activity. A lot of places shut down. There was a lot of industries shut down. People were sheltered in place, not only in the U.S., but in many places around the world. And the economies did suffer. For the U.S., that was mitigated a little bit by relief packages that Congress passed and the president signed into law, so that people could continue with consumption. But in terms of overall economic activity, that in August was expected to have dropped for 2020 by about 6% for the world, or about 5.5% for the world and 6% for the U.S. Now, I want to give a little different perspective on this right now, because we use those IHS Markit prices and economic projections in our models, and we're getting ready to do another baseline in November. Because of that, we have just now this week gotten a brand new set of economic data that we have not put in here. And I just want to let you know that as steep as these drops are here, the new projections, the new estimates for 2020 are not as dire. They're actually about 4.5% for the world and about 3.5% down for the US. So they're not quite as dire as we expected about 2 to 3 months ago. So that's coming off. And then the recovery periods look to be about the same. Now, you see in 2021 that this recovery is like 4% up for both the world and the US. That doesn't mean that the economic activity is 4% greater. It just means that the growth is about 4%. So if we shrank 7% or 6% in 2020, we grow 4%, we're still a couple of percent down from where we were in 2019. So it's going to take several years for the economic activity of both the US and the world as a whole to recover. So given that, we're going to have some consumption, a little weaker consumption in a lot of things than we ordinarily would have had if COVID had not happened. I just kind of want to, leave that economic view or that general economic view behind. Let's talk about what's happening in the important or the major agricultural sectors for Nevada. And this is a feeder cattle price, and these are daily prices. And as you can see, where we were at back at the beginning of the year, we were about $145, and these are national prices, about $145 per hundredweight, or for those of you that like to deal with it in pound, $1.45 a pound for those prices. By the time we got into March and April, we actually had a few periods where we hit down to about $108 per hundredweight. So those prices were very, very low. Ranchers were in a bind if they had to sell their feeder cattle at that time. Well, fortunately, that's not the major time of the year that those sales are made. And then the prices kind of climbed up steadily into late August or into September. And we'll go through some of the reasons why that is. But it started to look a little better for ranchers. Excuse me. However, since about the middle of September, those prices have kind of dropped steadily. We went from about $143, $145 then. We're down to about $125, $127 per hundredweight as of yesterday. These are the last prices yesterday from NASDAQ. So those prices have dropped quite a bit. So keeping that picture in mind, let's talk a little bit about why that occurred. You can see here that we're going to, this is cattle slaughter, and you can see here the red line is 2020, that we got back into, starting in March, back into April and May, and even into early June, that our slaughter was off. We knew that a lot of the processors and packing plants were shut down because of COVID, and that really dropped the demand in those places, and it pushed back on those prices. And that's the period of time, remember, that we saw the prices really weaken. These are slaughter cattle, but it backed up into the feeder cattle and all through the industry. Then it improved, and we just got September numbers out. And September numbers of slaughter seems to be holding up pretty well. So we're taking animals into the slaughterhouses. But one of the things that's occurring right now, and one of the reasons why our cattle prices are down a little bit, is that before you get to the slaughterhouses, you start looking in the feedlots, the supply of cattle is high. It's a lot higher than it was a year ago. So cattle on feed are higher. So there's more there, and in order to clear them out of the feedlots, they've got to really drop that price down there. So there is I don't want to call it a glut yet, but there is an excess supply of cattle sitting out there on feedlots that are ready for slaughter. And for that reason, those prices have dropped. And that's the main reason we're seeing that drop of about 10% in cattle prices over the last month. But having said that, the processors, the slaughterhouses, the packing plants are open and doing business. Those seems to be operating at about where they were a year ago, give or take from month to month. So they're operating pretty much at capacity. But now let's talk about what this means for our Nevada ranchers. And they're going to face some financial stress here. And this is the Nevada feeder steer price. The solid line in the projections were from January, and the dotted line are what we expected in August. And when we do our projections next month for the national, at the national level, I am expecting us to maybe not be quite this week, but still be below what we expected in January when we come back next month. So you can see that the feeder steer prices are down for Nevada. These are statewide annual averages, so they don't pick up the fluctuation that we've been seeing. But we're expecting that the feeder prices in Nevada will be down to $150 a hundredweight or less on average this year. And don't forget, that's including the early part of the year when the prices were higher into that average. And it's going to take into 2021, they're going to be relatively low because we still got those excess supplies of cattle sitting out there. And into 2022, before we start seeing a recovery and start to close back into what our earlier expectations were. So because of that, with these lower prices than we expected earlier in the year, if we were to pencil out the profitability for Nevada ranchers from what we expected in January, which was pretty healthy profitability, we were going into a period of rising cattle prices and rising profitability. That's not the case anymore, and those profits are severely diminished from what we expected before. So it's going to be a tough year, a tough couple of years for Nevada ranchers selling their calves and their feeder steers. So right now, it doesn't look like it's a real rosy picture for those ranchers. And there are a couple of other things that will exacerbate that a little bit. And we'll talk about that as we go on. I will just mention that feed costs, for example, particularly for overwinter or for supplemental for hay costs, are still high this year. And that's going to squeeze them a little bit more. So it's not, it's going to be kind of a tough year or so for our Nevada cattle ranches. Now I want to talk about the dairy side a little bit. And this is one that actually, frankly, has me scratching my head a little bit. A lot of this is futures market driven right now and what people are expecting. Why, as of the other day, were our Class 3, which is manufacturing grade milk, why were our Class 3 milk prices over $22 a hundredweight? Well, there are some partial explanations, and part of that is that we are maintaining production of cheese and butter, even though butter's Class 4, but cheese and things like that. So we're still drawing that milk off. But a lot of that milk recently has been going into inventories. So it's not on the consumption side that's really keeping things up so much, although the consumption side has improved since back in April and May as more restaurants and things have opened. But it's still not as strong as it could be. So we're putting things into inventories. But the expectations out there are that the manufacturing will take more of that milk off market and and process it. Here's where things get real iffy. And we have to remember that what these expectations are have been formed without without subsequent waves being severe and closing down the economy. That the COVID won't have a big of an impact on the economy and on manufacturing and on consumption that it did earlier this year. That is completely behind these expectations. If that happens and we end up with a lot of milk not going anywhere, having no place to go because manufacturing is shut down somewhat, this could turn around very, very quickly. And I looked at our dairy cow numbers in the U.S. and on our milk production in the U.S. And frankly, there was some slight downturn in April and May, and those were periods where we heard about producers dumping some milk, but that doesn't seem to be the case anymore. And our dairy cattle numbers, there haven't been very many dairy cattle liquidated out of herds. As a matter of fact, our dairy herds are pretty close to what they were a year ago. So we're still producing a lot of milk, and the milk yields don't seem to be down. So they're still feeding these animals. And so we've got plenty of milk around. So why these prices keep going up is a little bit of a head scratcher for me. I don't believe they can be sustained that high for a long period of time. Now, we are going into the holiday season where we do use more manufactured milk products. People like their wine and cheese parties. Are they going to have as many of those? People like their, you know, their butter and all that time of year. They eat fancier foods and that. Are we going to have smaller family gatherings? I mean, that's what our government, from the federal government to state and local governments, are suggesting for us. Whether people do that remains to be seen. I don't think it will be done to the extent that might need to be done. But I can't see the milk prices staying that high for a long period of time. And I would suspect in the next few months, those milk prices will start coming back down, kind of like they did into August and September. That makes more sense. But in the meantime, if the manufacturing grade milk remains up at that, that's a good thing for our dairy farmers. They'll make some extra money. So one of the important things is we turn this and take a look at Nevada for manufacturing. For Southern Nevada, they manufacture dairy products largely to go into the California markets, the Southern California markets. Those markets are likely holding up pretty well, so there'll be some places for them to go, take that milk off. But for the larger Northern Nevada dairy production area, we do have fluid milk that we bottle, that we maintain that bottling for mostly for local consumption. Although that local consumption, like every place, is down because of school lunches in particular and other institutional things that are down a little bit. But we have, for Northern Nevada, we have the whole milk powder plant, which can also produce skim milk powder as well, in Fallon. Now, if we look at this, our largest customer for that plant was China, or has been China. As you can see, since about the middle of 2018, China's kind of pulled out of that market a little bit. And they started to come back up early in 2020. And this data goes through the third quarter of 2020. So it's very, very current quarterly data. And the volume that the US is sending to China is very much smaller than it was just a few years ago. So we have to kind of turn to that skim milk powder market as well, which is much larger, and it's much more of a U.S. market. So there are places to send that. But there is one other, however, to this export market for whole milk powder, and that's that if we look at the global market that the U.S. serves, China's not the biggest, not the majority of that market. We have a whole lot of other nations and whole other markets that we serve, and up until the third quarter, those were holding up pretty well. As we look at the second quarter here, and through that period of time, those were holding up pretty well. The third quarter fell quite a bit. So the global markets are much smaller. And the other piece of this is that we're not the major competitor on global markets. It's New Zealand is the biggest one. Australia does. The EU actually in North African markets, the EU is very competitive in those markets. So as those markets shrink, or as those other competitors, particularly New Zealand, become more competitive, put more product out there, we're going to kind of be sources that is going to be secondary to a lot of places. So we've kind of hit that. So I'm thinking that for Nevada, they can probably maintain that whole milk powder plant operating, but the global markets are smaller. And if we look at whole milk powder prices on the global market, those South Pacific prices that are largely New Zealand, those prices are quite low compared to what they had been before. So the profitability of that is going to shrink. So there are even some cracks in the dairy market, particularly for Nevada producers. And we talk about sheep and lamb a little bit. And this was one sector that we haven't talked a whole lot about in the past, because the data is frankly harder to find than it is for the other commodities. But we've been able to find some data recently. Now, remembering the slaughter chart that we showed at the beginning for cattle, this is a similar one. It's for sheep and lamb slaughter. This is our 1,000 heads. And you can see that generally it's holding up between 175,000 and 200,000 head per month. And this is through September. September actually saw a little resurgence in this. The big difference here is back in April, where we saw slaughter for cattle and other animals decline sharply. We also had a big difference from a year ago. Even though it didn't show a big decline from previous months, it missed that Passover huge bump that we get. We weren't able to supply as much as normal, as much as would be needed for Passover. So we missed out on that one, a sharp drop, and that really reduced the prices for sheep and lamb meat out there. But right now we're holding up, although those prices still haven't recovered very greatly. It's the sheep and lamb sector is a little tough one, and there are a lot of animals sitting out there in slaughter positions. So the prices are down, although we're holding slaughter up quite well. But perhaps the largest issue for the sheep and lamb sectors is the wool price. What's going on with this? The wool price is much more impacted by the international market. For the U.S., the sheep and lamb meat is largely a U.S. market. And so as the U.S. goes for that, so goes that demand and the need for slaughter. But the wool markets are very much impacted by international markets, primarily on the supply side, the Australian market, and on the demand side, again, China. China looms large in a lot of international trade for agricultural commodities. So as you can see, this is the Australian wool price. It's an East Coast market for Australia. That's Sydney, Brisbane, places like that, and it's where they're close to their export points, where they serve a lot of the Pacific area and a lot of the world indeed, as well as China. They're the biggest suppliers to China. As you can see, and here we are, we're right back into that March period there. Whoops, that's not what I wanted to do. Okay, and as you can see, that once we hit early or the middle of March, when COVID started hitting the world markets, that the wool prices dropped, and they dropped continually for almost 6 months into September. They were down to not much more than half of where they were at their peak in March. They've started a resurgence here lately, but the Chinese really got out of the global wool, not just wool markets, but the Chinese got out of a lot of agricultural markets. They really cut imports of a lot of things, and it impacted a lot of agricultural commodity prices on the world market, particularly ones where the Chinese were big in importing. But since the beginning of September, for about the last almost 2 months now, we've seen a resurgence in wool prices, but they are still only about 80%, 75 or 80% of what they were back in March. We are seeing some increases in wool prices. And one of the things that we have to realize is that this is coming at the same time when we start looking at our Southern Hemisphere periods, that we are now in November, we're kind of comparable for Australia for what May is here. And so we're getting wool prices up at the same time that supply is going up too. They're into their shearing season. So we're getting bigger supplies, and that means that offtake, that the global economy is starting to recover. The Chinese are starting to import again. They're starting to recover. So we're beginning to see an uptick in wool prices. That's good for Nevada producers. Our sheep flock in Nevada, and we've got a portion of it that is very high quality wool. It's among the highest quality in the U.S. and the world. That comes from our merino flock. And that's because it's very fine wool, and it's really, really coveted for manufacturing a lot of fine items. So we get a premium in Nevada over just regular average wool prices. So the wool prices in Nevada should be recovering, and again, they're at a premium for other places. So that's one, the sheep for the wool, the sheep meat not so much. The wool is beginning to recover, but that's still weak. So if you take those two things in together, if you look at the current market situation for our sheep and lamb sector in Nevada, it's still pretty weak. And we had talked about the cattle sector weakening. We talked about the sheep and lambs being weak. We talked about the dairy sector being relatively decent right now. So it's been kind of a hit and miss, a mixed bag for Nevada agriculture. Here's another positive one. And this is where I'm going to want to end this little talk. As we start talking about our hay prices. If you look at the solid lines, those are 2019 prices. These are monthly prices, and these are Nevada averages. So anybody's hay prices may not look like this, depending on where you're at in the state, the quality of your hay, and for the other hay, what it is, whether it's high quality Timothy or something else. Your prices may be, considerably different than this, but these are state average prices. The dashed lines are for 2020. Unfortunately, we have only had data released through August. I'm really curious to see what the September numbers might look like. Again, COVID is impacting our ability to collect and publish data out there by the USDA and by the state. It's just a fact of life right now. So I don't know what the September prices is, but I suspect that they're probably still holding up pretty well. So if you look at the dashed lines compared to the solid lines, you can see that both the blue and the red dashed lines are above the corresponding solid lines. And what that means is that hay prices this year, particularly since about the middle of the year, are significantly higher than they were a year ago. And hay prices for both alfalfa and for other hays are $180 a ton, or even for the other hay, $190 a ton. They jumped up in August per ton compared to 175 or 170 a year ago. So hay prices are considerably higher than they were 1 year ago. There's a couple of reasons for this. One, it depends on what the water source has been, whether there's been available water for irrigation this year. By and large, for the surface water, if we look at the estimation of yields right now, they're still up pretty high, particularly for the irrigated alfalfa. But the yields are down a little bit in some areas. The other thing is that I want to talk about and why hay prices might be up, and this is kind of where I want to almost where I want to end it, is if we look at our hay cuttings, this is Nevada hay acreage this year, or since 2000. If we look at the 2020 acreage, we're at about 335, I think is the number, 1,000 acres in Nevada. That's what's being harvested. If we look at last year, we were more than 100,000 acres above that. When we had the preliminary numbers for the planting intentions back at the end of March in the prospective plantings report the USDA puts out. Nevada producers had said that they were expecting to harvest about the same amount that they did last year in 2019. They've fallen far short this year. And this is the data through October. So our hay season is just about over, and we just don't have the quantities out there that were harvested in Nevada. Now we can buy hay from Idaho and from Utah, but hay's bulky, expensive to transport. So we've got a little bit less hay sitting out there than what we ordinarily would have had. And we are now getting ready to go into the hay feeding time of year when, particularly in the north part of the state, cattle and sheep are taken off the range and are fed supplements and hay and other feeds. So we're now moving into that time of year where our demand for hay will be higher, which is another reason why I expect those prices to remain somewhat elevated as we go on through the fall and into early next year. We just don't have the hay supplies that we had a year ago. However, having said that, if we look on a per harvested acre, not a total revenues for producers, but what they get off of a harvested acre, because we still have yields holding up relatively well and we have good prices, that our operating, our total revenues per acre, we expect them to hold up quite well. We've got stable hay prices out there. Our expectations are for them to remain 175 to 180 bucks a ton, maybe low 180s for Nevada out there. And our costs were reduced this year. In 2020, a lot of that was fuel costs. But our costs were reduced, and they're going to start climbing back up. But over the next couple of years, through 2022, we expect to see hay producers on a per acre basis do pretty well. Now, the kicker here is, again, if their area is reduced, then they're going to lose on that part, and they might not be able to make up total revenues if they have a 20 or 25% reduction in area. But on a per harvested acre basis, that looks pretty well, particularly if somebody is able to maintain their acreage. And going into the next couple of years, that might be difficult because we're in a drought, and if you watch the weather, the drought is severe in much of the state, and in some of the state, it's getting near the extreme part of it. So it's very severe, and is going to start giving us some issues with water. Whether the surface water will be there to support the allocations that producers have or not in the next couple of years. If we have the winter we're talking about maybe this year, I think allocations might be cut next year. And for those that are on groundwater, if their aquifers can't recharge, particularly as we get over in the eastern part of the state, like Diamond Valley, that's been an ongoing issue for several decades now. And as that gets worse, that part of the state could see some real severe cuts in the hay production. So that's about where I would like to take this. That's just kind of a snapshot of where we are with our four largest agricultural sectors in the state. At this time, I'd like to open it up for any questions or comments.
All right, Mike, thank you. I'd like to start with Malieka. Malieka's back from maternity leave, and do you have any questions for Mike?
What Mike focused on at the end in terms of the drought conditions, I think is going to be most telling on the hay in particular. I was looking quickly as you were talking at the drought monitor for our neighboring states, Utah, Idaho, Arizona. I don't know that we get much hay from them, but Utah is in a worse drought condition as of today than we are. So that is also going to have a large influence on the demand and prices and availability of hay. Yes, in terms of
absolutely.
Inputs. So that I just say keep an eye on that drought monitor and thinking about how that will impact the flow through costs to the livestock markets as well.
Absolutely. That's a good point, is that these higher costs that we have and lower availability, particularly for the for the cow-calf producers and for the sheep producers over the winter, they're going to be squeezed even more because of high feed costs. So that's a very good point. I believe looking at the drought monitor for Idaho, though, Idaho is not as severe as.
Correct. Idaho looks like they're really, I mean, they're in decent condition compared to us. I was surprised at how bad off Utah is as of today. It looks like almost a third of the state is in, so I'm not saying the wrong thing.
Well, the weather moves from west to east, so.
D4, yeah, a huge portion. Yeah. So our eastern, you were talking about those eastern counties that are in D4, which is exceptional. And yeah, that flows into Utah. And then in Utah, it stretches a very large swath of north to south. Yeah, it looks to be almost a little between a quarter and a third of the state of Utah is in severe, exceptional D4 drought.
Yeah, and the eastern counties in Nevada are the counties where, if you look where our livestock production is, operations and the number, I mean, they're all over the state. There's no doubt about that. But in our most eastern counties, that's where it's concentrated more, both the cattle and the sheep. And that brings up another point of what the drought will do is, in terms of the need for supplemental feeding next year, could be greater because we're not going to get the biomass on federal grazing lands either that we would have gotten last year, and maybe this year because there's decent growth early in the spring this year. I wouldn't expect that for next year if things are there. So there may be a need for more supplemental feeding even during the grazing season next year.
Well, Mike, I think, with Malieka, if you look at your local weather almost all through this summer, there's been a big high that's been knocking things up to the Pacific Northwest, and it doesn't surprise me that Idaho is wet. But I think one good point you have to bring up that you brought up is for our alfalfa producers and most specifically our cattle producers. Utah is in bad shape because of this high that knocked things around, but to get supplementary hay from another state costs a lot of money.
Yes.
And so there's no near place for this. And so it's going to be higher prices. Our Nevada cattlemen face next year during this drought, prices going on their output going down, and also simultaneously prices of their inputs going up.
Yeah. Well, you're right, Tom. Those hay costs, not only prices going up for the winter feeding, but if they have to feed supplemental stuff during the grazing season, that's an expense that they don't normally incur. I don't know that the cattle prices will continue to go down. I would almost expect to see a recovery once we get, particularly if our consumption remains up and stuff through the winter. Depending on what happens with the second or third wave of COVID, whichever one we're in, how that impacts the economy and the restrictions on people doing things. But if that holds up, then this kind of bulge in what's on the feedlots will eventually be mitigated and come back down, and those cattle prices should start edging back up a little bit as we go into next year. I'm hoping that that's what will happen, but it all depends on this pandemic. I mean, that's, we always talk about uncertainty. Mm-hmm. When we say uncertainty, when we say, well, I'm uncertain about this, which means I'm thinking about it and I can see several ways that it might go. I think uncertainty is not necessarily the term that I want to use, at least for me. I just don't know. It's not that I'm uncertain about stuff. I just don't know at all. And I think that's really more realistic to where we're at right now.
Well, I would say risky to set probabilities with math. Uncertainty is
That's right.
The other thing that I think sometimes we focus just in the western area with this drought. But if I look in the east and the southeast, there's been tremendous rains. And so cattle production in the Midwest and the South and the other areas, they look like they may be producing more that might buffer any. In the West, we may see liquidation of cattle because I'm unable to feed and all this.
Right.
However, on the East Coast, there may be regular markets. So how you see that's balanced as the Midwest and Southeast cattle production, are they kind of increasing, or would they have some impact on prices that may transfer over here to the West?
They would. We got to remember that even our cow calf industry is in Nevada is subject to the national cattle trends. You know, the meat consumption, the slaughter that we have, slaughter steer prices. Those are it's all related. And then when we start talking about Nevada, Utah, even into Arizona, New Mexico, and look at those cattle numbers compared to a lot of those Midwestern states, we're kind of the smaller areas, and we feed into their feedlots in those states. So yeah, it's very easy for those states, if they have a good year, to more than offset what happens here.
And I guess also for the next few years, just for our people, is that I see the Federal Reserve still being very soft. So the impact of interest rates as to increasing cost of capital, I think for the next few years, it's still going to be low. That's not going to be a big deal like it was sometimes when you and I were young. It was 12%.
Tom, you were never young, but
that's right.
No, that's right. The cost of capital will be less. So what that says is, COVID notwithstanding, if somebody wants to expand and incur capital costs, that certainly helps. But don't forget, it's not just those that the interest rates are for the are just the long term, but we've also seen some shorter term interest rates are. So that will help operating costs, annual operating costs for ranchers and farmers as they borrow to meet their operating needs from year to year. So that's right. The lower interest rates will help both short term and long term.
And one last one, I'm working with Stacy and would be working on this beginning farmers. If somebody was beginning in the rancher, what problems are these prices showing to them?
Well, they're showing a couple. One, particularly if you're a local or Western rancher, you're going to, and it depends on where you're at in the state, on the input side. Because if you're in the southern part of the state and you've got the BLM lease on there, enough for maybe a full year or 10 months out of the year on those lease rates, you're much less exposed to higher hay costs and other feed costs. But if you're in the north, where you've got a 6-month grazing season and a 6-month alternate feeding season, you're very exposed to those costs. So on that side, that makes it difficult. On the output side, the lower cattle prices that we've got now, and that we're probably going to see a little bit for the next year or so, even though they'll improve from where they're at now, is going to make it a little difficult for you to make a buck there, particularly if you're starting off and you've got some capital expenses in there where you have to incorporate more long-term costs. You have to be able to make those payments as well. It's going to be a little difficult. Doesn't mean it can't be done, but it's, if I were a beginning rancher, I'd have to think twice about going into it right now.
Sure.
But I am certainly not the expert on that. I don't want anybody at the farm on what I just said.
Well, no, what you mean, they're going to have to be very financially astute.
Yes. Yes.
They're going to have to watch what their costs are because of this.
Yes.
I guess, is there any final thing you'd like to say, Mike, before we adjourn?
I think I said enough.
Okay, well, vote on that, and it passes as unanimous. So, Mike, thank you very much. I think we'll have this next month because there's some new prices coming out. There's election that's going through. I don't know if it's going to be determined, all that. The one I'm worried about is with all this political mess, the PPP and a lot of those stimulus things may not be out there. That will impact on it, Mike. Even though people may see this, and if unemployment's not enhanced, or we have some PPP loans, or there's no stimulus, that's going to come back to hit the ag sector because there's your demand.
Exactly. And that's what the one thing that has helped support
you bet
consumption, food as well as other things, has been those stimulus packages. And if we don't get that, although I suspect that after the election we'll get that once the politicians stop, you know.
Well, also we'll have pigs flying.
Yeah, well, true.
One thing is kind of interesting what you're saying. If you look at the state of Nevada's sales tax year over year, it's had a slight increase, even with this great recession. That's because all the stimulus monies, people have been buying goods and services, and that's been keeping our sales tax. What's very unusual is that non-store sectors, these you buy stuff in the box, have really increased. And I guess that's going to have an impact on the ag sector because that's a different thing going on too. Well, okay, I appreciate your time. Like I said, we'll probably do something later in November when we figure out, or 1st of December, get a feel of what's going on, because there's changes going on, and and what Mike's saying, and also there's drought, but the political and anything that has come on that would be interesting on the new. I think even the people that estimate the economic prices, they're going to be making changes too. So we live in uncertain times, and so Mike and Malieka, thank you, and we'll talk to you later.